Thank you, Icon Scotland, for organising this, and thanks everybody for attending. So during lockdown, one of my tasks has been to take on digitising of some of our paper-based conservation records. These records that I'm particularly involved in digitising date back from 1986, and this was a key point in the history of the National Museums of Scotland. In 1985, the National Heritage Scotland Act had been passed, and that formed the National Museums of Scotland, formerly from an amalgamation of the Royal Scottish Museum and the National Museum of Antiquities. And part of that was also the Scottish United Services Museum and the Museum of Light, which had already been part of the Royal Museum. So this also meant an amalgamation of separate conservation labs, which were dotted across Edinburgh. So next slide, please, Claire. So I'm just concentrating on the areas where we had a principal labs. So the Royal Museum had labs up in the Northwest Attic. Next slide, Claire, please. And there was a conservation lab at the Scottish United Services Museum, now the National War Museum, up at Edinburgh Castle. Next slide, please. And then the conservation labs that were at York Buildings, and these were conservation labs for the National Museum of Antiquities. And the Conservation Analytical Research Department was formed with Jim Tate being the head of conservation. Next slide, please, Claire. So with this new formation of the new conservation service, a new documentation system was set up. So we had these paper-based conservation records, and this system would basically have a lifespan from about 1986 to 1993, and I was in the process of scanning the ones starting from 1986 to 87. So the system, the documentation, they're filed roughly chronologically. Each record is allocated and filed sequentially by a conservation request or a job number. That seems sometimes quite a common way of filing the records. And we have basically duplicate records for each object. So you'll have a condition report filed in one folder, a lever arch folder, and a treatment report in a second folder. So overall, that equates, we have over that period about 20,000 records in all. So so when starting sort of digitally scanning these at home, and I've been sort of like, it's thrown a bit of a light on the history of the conservation of collections, and I'm just going to highlight a few examples of these. So next slide, please, Claire. So some of the conservation records have quite good detail of descriptions of condition. For example, we have a record here for an object that we found, and actually unusually, the conservator here, Brian Melville, recorded that it's actually been previously conserved by W. Samuel in 1888, and this is probably the first time we have a name for a very early conservator restorer working within the Royal Museum collections. We don't really have records of practitioners really before the 1950s, and a lot of the conservation restoration is largely anonymous. Next slide, please. And then another thing we're looking at, or is highlighted, is some of the sort of like the bulk and standard type treatments. The Scottish United Services Museum and the Royal Museum had access to a commercial dry cleaning machine, and a lot of the military and uniforms were standardly dry cleaned using Arclone, but this was discontinued. And my own personal recollection was this was about 1995-96, and it also features the system was featured in the Textile Conservators Manual, in the Textile Conservators Manual. The solvent was Arclone, which was a fluorocarbon, and obviously banned for health and safety reasons, and that was why it was discontinued. But there's records become very, there's a lot of shorthand. So you have a record here where you say just dry clean, and that today means probably something completely different to us in terms of standards of cleaning, maybe a dry brush or a vacuum, whereas this is literally dry cleaning. Next slide, please. So in the documents as a whole entity, show sort of like everything in context and the sort of the ordering of things. So my last example here is about what happened, events that happened in 1986 in the collections. And I just put it into context. At that time in June 1986, Doctor and the Medics were #1 with Spirit in the Sky. And there was a young conservator called Charles Stoble starting his conservation career. And then 1986 was an incredibly wet year, apparently the 6th wettest in the 20th century. So next slide, please, Claire. And this wetness seemed to have an impact in the Royal Museum, because on the 9th of June, as I was scanning through going through the files, I found a sequence of Chinese ceramics and cloisonné enamels that are having to be cleaned to remove rainwater staining. And this kind of piqued my interest about why rainwater staining was being removed from these objects. And next slide, please, Claire. I went in sort of check things like the Met Office data and found that the sort of like the 9th of the Sunday, the 8th of June, and the early morning of the 9th, there was terrific high levels of persistent rain in Scotland. And next slide, please, Claire. And the ceramics, which were what I found to be located on the 2nd floor of the gallery in inside cases that lined the walls, had been affected by this rainwater. Obviously, it had been raining so hard it ingressed into the cases, and they'd had to be recovered and cleaned. And then there was repeated another flood incident on the 29th of July as well. And we have another sort of like probably another object, a piece of Tibetan metalwork that was probably badly affected as well. And there was quite a detailed report on this as well. Next slide, Claire. So today, those galleries have been changed with the Royal Museum master plan redevelopment. It's now the Sculpture Gallery. The case has been development, but looking into these archives and looking at individual records, you see something like a pattern, and you can check out locations where things were and how basically the objects were interactive with the building and where we might have potential weaknesses in the fabric of the building. Last slide, please, Claire. So just to sum up what I've been learning from my sort of dropped in at the deep end archiving is that things like the chronological work requests and ordering can give a collective picture of events and the impact of the collections on the buildings. And what I'm trying to do is basically link these records into our new collections database via the object number, but we also have to bear in mind that we have these important links with the other information as well, and trying to preserve that as well. A lot of this, things like locations, have come from my own personal collective, my own memory of things happening in the museum, and there's this sort of importance of professional collective memory as well, where we can sort of fill in the gaps that appear in the sort of documentation. And that's how I've sort of, a lot of the information I've found. And there's lots of incidental information about, as well as like location history and exhibitions that these objects were in that are featured in the conservation documentation. And lastly, some of the reports are very economical. They don't give a lot of information. They might just say good condition, but it gives you a baseline about what people perceive the condition of the object to be at that time, and as just as valid as a very comprehensive treatment report. So thanks very much for your attention.